evening, Ridgeway New Rochelle. Good evening, those online. I'm going to give a little bit of a testament tonight about my experience with small groups. As you may have heard in the previous weeks, we're going to be launching some small groups here at Ridgeway New Rochelle. Although we've had our men's ministry and our women's prayer, we're excited that this fall there's going to be some more groups launching. So I think Titus is going to give a bit more detail to that, and I'm going to talk to you about my experience. So my first community, probably like many of you, was your family, right? I'm Jaimee. I should have probably started with that. And I'm a daughter to Philip and Donna. I was a sibling, or I am a sibling, I should say, to Hamish and Simon and Jeremy, my brothers and sisters, and obviously a friend from as long as I could remember. I think my oldest friend I've actually known since I was 2 years of age. So you can get a sense that like community and friendship is just part of our natural being. And of course, as life went on and I went to college, I became later a colleague, a wife to Nathan, and a mother to Henry and Chloe and Ryan. It was really when I left home. I grew up in New Zealand in quite a small town. When I left home to go to college, for the first time, I felt quite alone. I am one of four, so I'd always been around noise, and there was always plenty of people around at our house, people to play with. But as my dad drove me up to college, because he didn't trust that I'd get there myself, it was an 8-hour drive. And as he said goodbye, I could see that he, was really quite emotional about it. And I'm sure one day I will go through the same thing. I was ready to go. And it wasn't until I arrived at where I was staying, I didn't go for dorm life. I went and lived in kind of an apartment, I guess, with one other Christian girl who I didn't know, that I really actually felt a sense of loneliness and isolation. And it made me think that, on reflection, not at the time perhaps, but loneliness can come in two forms, so I feel. One is, if you don't have any community around, you are actually in isolation. And sometimes we forget that, sadly, this is a reality for so many people even today. And then there's the second type, that despite a person being in community, perhaps having friendships, having colleagues, even being in church and being surrounded by Christians, that someone can still feel isolated or alone because perhaps they aren't truly known. Their true self isn't really known and shared with the people around them. Well, I ended up at my flatmate's church, and soon after, a small group was advertised for young adults, which was me at the time. And I decided to give it a go, and so I turned up to the introduction night. And I was probably quite nervous because I didn't know anyone. And I think when I got there, I was even more nervous because I soon realized that most of the people in the group knew each other. But they were welcoming and they were friendly. And then the book got introduced, and I had to hunt it off my bookshelf. And it was this book by John Ortberg. I don't know if any of you have read it or have read any of John Ortberg's books. It's called Everybody's Normal Till You Get to Know Them. And that was my first step into small group. And this book actually ended up being a real helpful tool for me to unpack what it truly means to be in a small group and what's required to be part of authentic community. I think I laughed at the title because, the back says normal. Who's normal? And so tonight I'm just going to share a couple of things that I learned from this study, and then a little bit more about my experiences of small groups. So Ortberg starts this book and he talks about when you go into a store, a retail store, there's sometimes a section in the store, and it's usually up the back or in a corner, and it's called as is, okay? It's reduced items, aka perhaps damaged goods. And they won't always point out what's wrong with the goods. Perhaps something doesn't button on it. Perhaps it's got a small hole. but it kind of serves as a warning that you've got to take the item as it is. And of course, there's bargains to be had. Ortberg talks about the reality every single human being who has ever walked the earth comes as is. Often we like to think of others as comes as is, but what about ourselves? Have you ever considered that you are in the as-is department as well? Or perhaps for you, it's the opposite. It's easy for you to see yourself as is and to see your own flaws, but to assume that other people in your communities, other people in your friendships have it together or don't have struggles like you do. I'm going to read directly from a passage in the book. He says, we all want to look normal, to think of ourselves as normal, but the writers of the scripture insist that no one is totally normal, at least not as God defines normal. All we like sheep have gone astray, they tell us. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And then Ortberg goes on to outline the many messed up families there are in Genesis, and I'm sure you've read Genesis, or you can go and reread through that recount. But why does the writer of Genesis include all this stuff, all these broken relationships, all these kind of inter-family problems? There's an important reason. The writer of Scripture is trying to establish a deep theological truth. Everybody is weird. Can you guys say that? Everybody is weird, right? That sounds a little weird saying it. So what does that weirdness mean? He said, everybody's weird. This is such a fundamental insight. You may want to close this book for a moment and share this thought with the person closest to you, or perhaps it most reminds you of, or perhaps these are the same person. Because we know in our hearts that it is not the way we're supposed to be, we try to hide our weirdness. Every one of us pretends to be healthier and kinder than we perhaps really are. We all engage in what might be called depravity management. I think as I read this next part, we've, heard things and things have come out in these past few years, but every once in a while, somebody as is, someone who is high profile and as is, perhaps a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, becomes known guilty of plagiarism. Perhaps a politician's career explodes because of some scandal. A CEO resigns because of some disgrace over something they have done illegally. What is surprising is not that these things happen, it's that the general public response is, can you believe it? And they seem so normal, as if you and I, of course, would be incapable of such behavior. And so some nearly 20 years ago began my small group journey with this book. And many of the people that I met in this study, in this small group, there was probably about 15 of us, and 4 really great older people from our church who led it. They're still very much a part of my life, even though from afar they're all in New Zealand or in different bits of the world. But being away from my community and home life really has intensified for me just how much I need Christian community. Ortberg said, our need for community with people and the God who made us is to the human spirit what food and air and water are to the human body. The need does not go away, even in the face of all the weirdness. And so if we think about these past couple of years, I at this point am lost what year we're in with the pandemic. I think that's been even highlighted more, that isolation is a really hard thing. Even, I guess, to the most introverted person. Community is what God has made us for, and also community is the place where God often meets us. I was having brunch with a friend a week ago, and she was having a rough time. She's not a Christian, and this past year and a half has been really hard for her. She's a Brit, and so she's living, away from all of her family. She moved from Brooklyn to Larchmont and has had her second child in the height of COVID. She finished maternity leave recently, and she's just begun working from home with her child, who's now 18 months, and if you've got an 18-month-old, you'll know what that's like, as well as her 5-year-old. And, it's really impacting her that she hasn't seen her family for such a long time. And she turned to me and she said, Jaimee, I thought that the people that I'd meet here, as in where she's living, would be more friendly than what I've experienced. And you often know I can't do this without crying. That really broke my heart. It really did. Isolation is no fun. And I could see her pain and her loneliness. In Ortberg's book, he tells about a story of this book that is called the All Better Book. It's a book where elementary children, so that's all my kids over there now this year, they try to solve some of the world's hardest problems. And among the questions about the ozone layer and health issues, the toughest question that was posed was this: with billions of people in the world, someone should be able to find out a system where no one is lonely. What do you suggest? And so I want to read you a few of the kids' responses. Kalani, age 8, who it says she's obviously she has a gift of administration, says she said, people should find lonely people and ask their name and address. Then they ask the people who aren't lonely their name and address. And when you have an even amount of each, you sign them up together through the newspaper and they can meet. Max, age 9, said, you could make food that talks to you when you eat. For instance, it would say, how are you doing? And what happened to you today? Matt, aged 8, said, we could get people a pet or a husband or a wife and take them places. Said under Matt, this makes you wonder about Matt's understanding of marriage. But the most touching response, the one that can break your heart, came last. It was from a little boy called Brian, aged 8. He said, sing a song, stomp your feet, read a book. Sometimes I think no one loves me, and so I do all of these. So there has been many seasons in my life. I started with my small group community when I was a young adult, had moved fresh from home. And there's been many different groups that I have been in. Nathan and I moved to the US from New Zealand 10 and a half years ago, I'm going to say. He's doing the math. And we were both back at square one. We knew no one. We had never been even to the East Coast. We had seen different parts of the States, but not the East Coast. So in terms of not knowing people, not having a church, we were quite isolated. I think Nathan arrived 9 weeks before me. I was finishing a job, and when I arrived, obviously I was excited to see Nathan. We had been apart for 9 weeks, but I didn't have any girlfriends. So Nathan was really like my husband and my girlfriend. So I would just talk his ear off. He would come home from work and he had been around people. He'd probably been stressed, had a hard day, and I was there to chat. I could obviously ring people on the phone in New Zealand, but I just needed someone to talk to. But you know what? Community soon followed. We found a church. We landed at Redeemer on the east side, and it was a large church. And I thought, you know what? I need to find a small group. I need to find a community. It required me to put myself out there again, to make myself uncomfortable with a new group of people, to remind myself that I was just coming as is, and that the person next to me was as is as well. Ortberg says to experience community is to know the joy of belonging, the delight at being known and loved, and the opportunity for giving and growing, the safety of finding a true home. So I'm going to admit sometimes I'm a slow learner. Perhaps it's only been in the last 5 years or so that some of my learnings from this book have circled back to me. And I think even the fact that I was asked to share tonight was God's gracious reminder to me to remind myself the importance of small groups, of community. I was able to reflect and remember how important it is to do life with others. motherhood saw me in another season, and when we moved from the city, from New York to New Rochelle, we ended up at Ridgeway White Plains. I became very caught up in these three wonderful beings over here who I love. But looking after three children under 3.5, my goal was survival. As if they were alive at the end of the day and everyone was in one piece, it was a good job. But I also became quite isolated. I didn't always want to admit or share with others how isolating I was finding it. I ended up at a Beth Moore simulcast event. I can't even remember the topic, but Creative Women had organised this at Ridgeway White Plains. And I felt like what I needed at that time was a kiwi. I don't know, what do you guys think I'm saying when I say I need a kiwi? Anyone out there? Who's not? Yeah. I needed someone from New Zealand, and I have grown to love, y'all. I'm still learning everything about culture, but I think my heart was really wanting someone who understood my culture, understood my upbringing. And so I remember praying and asking God for my kiwi. And of course, I turn up at this event. I'm ushered inside. I think I was directed where to sit down by one of the ushers. And I ended up sitting between Amy Van Dantham, who we all know and love, and then to the other side of me was my kiwi, Helena, who she's no longer in the States, but God was so gracious in answering my need for my Kiwi community. And since then, I think it was probably 2015, I feel like I've really managed to stay in community, in small groups. It hasn't always been easy. It's been a juggle with time and things like that, and schedules and kids. But it has been so important to my spiritual growth to do life with others. Just a couple of years ago, Nathan and I did something we've never done. You may be wondering what that is. We were invited to join a small group, and after 10 years of marriage, we had never done a small group together. It wasn't to say that we obviously had been in our own small groups, but just Nathan travels quite a bit, and it was really hard to actually get to a small group together. So we joined a couple's small group, and it was just a wonderful community to be part of. Community and small groups take time. Ortberg suggests that one of the biggest barriers to deep connectedness for us is simply the pace of our lives. And I know that had been real in my life and in Nathan's life. I can say in all honesty, I have yet to have a bad experience of a small group. In small groups, I've felt really welcomed. I've felt loved. I've felt deep connectedness to my Christian brothers and sisters. I've laughed and laughed, especially in our last small group. The stories and just the way you get to know people over shared food and shared meals and prayer. We have, I think, a series of people praying or asleep from our last small group. Mainly the men. I've seen God move in mysterious ways, and I've been witness to answered prayer, and God has allowed me to be used, and God has used others to speak life into me. Wisdom has been imparted, and in people seeing me as is, and in doing life with as is people, deeper relationships have been formed. I don't know, as you sit here tonight, what your small group experience have been, if they've been good, if they've been not so good, if they've brought life and growth. But all I can say is that I would encourage you to prayerfully consider small groups, Ridgeway, New Rochelle, this fall. We were built for community, and I know without a shadow of doubt that as I look out to our community, it is what they deeply need too. We are as-is people, dealing with as-is people, and that can be messy, but it can be beautiful as well. Tim Keller once said, "To be known and not loved is our greatest fear, but to be fully known and truly loved, well, That's a lot like being loved by God. It is what we need more than anything. It liberates us from pretense. It humbles us out of our self-righteousness, and it fortifies us for any difficulty that life can throw at us. So I'd encourage you to consider doing life together this fall, to listen to what Titus is going to share about small groups, and to really consider being a part of a